Good afternoon, folks. My name is Roxanne Pereira. I am the Equity Anti-Racism Program Coordinator and Accessibility Program Coordinator here at EMANS. I just want to welcome you all here to our Lunch and Learn. This Lunch and Learn is funded by the Accessibility Directorate. And so we are in the traditional ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq, known as the Mi'kmaqi. As treaty people, we're committed to reconciliation and reconciliation as well. We would also like to recognize that Nova Scotia is home to over 50 African Nova Scotian communities whose culture, heritage, and histories have been and remain a key part of this province for more than 400 years. And we honor and offer gratitude to those ancestors of African descent as well as Indigenous people who came here before us to this land. And I'd just like to introduce you to Corey Melanson, who comes from Seachange Colab, and I will pass it over to you.
Great. Hi, everyone. I know we're a small group today, but this will go far and wide in the recording, I believe. My name is Corey Melanson, and I am the Strategy and Learning Lead with Seachange Collab. And part of, I'll share a little bit more about Seachange Collab in a bit. I am a white, queer, neurodivergent settler, and really, so Roxanne, when you talked about sort of, when I think about being a settler and what does that mean in terms of being a treaty person as well, that's, lots of learning and unlearning. I will do just a short visual description of myself. So I have shoulder length brown hair. I have silver dangly earrings and a blue sweater today. And this is an accessibility best practice in meetings, whether they're in person or virtual, for folks who have low vision. So today we are talking about accommodations at work. And, there's an image on the screen of a man in a wheelchair measuring the height of a table at a cafe. So that's one accommodation, a physical an adjustment to a physical environment. We'll be talking about a whole range of accommodations today. And we're able to do this work through the Accessibility Confident Employers, or ACE project. And the ACE project is a project of Seachange and is funded by the government of Canada and the province of Nova Scotia. And so what I want to just do, so normally I do also a land acknowledgement, and but one of the things I like to ask is, I think, Roxanne, you mentioned the number of African Nova Scotian communities, 50, but I'm curious if folks could put in the chat, how many First Nations communities are there in Nova Scotia? So if you can just put a number in the chat. And again, what you'll find out is there isn't any one right number. So don't feel like you can't put a number in if you don't know. So just like, what do you think is the number of First Nations communities in Nova Scotia? Any guesses here? Pop a number in the chat. Yay, thank you, Rosemary. 200. That's a big number. So there are actually, Michelle, 13. Yeah, so there actually are 13 bands, but there are 42 communities across Nova Scotia. So I just feel like as we talk about any kind of equity issue, bringing that lens into the room is important. The next thing I want to ask you is like, what do accommodations at work mean to you? So you could write that in the chat, or if anyone wants to come off mute and just sort of share, like, what does that mean to you in your workplace? What do accommodations mean? Anyone willing to come off mute and share what that means in your... Oh, good. Yeah, Rosemary. So flexible hours and work locations. Absolutely. So that's sort of an adjustment of like time and location. Great. Thanks, Rosemary. It's always this thing when we say, put it in the chat, and then it takes time to write that in the chat. And we'll be kind of doing this deeper dive about accommodations. So yeah, so that is like one kind of accommodation. And what I'm hoping that you'll kind of take away from this session is the broad range of accommodations. So I like to start anything I'm doing in terms of training with why. Why is accommodation so important? And through the ACE project, one of our principles is nothing about us without us, which really, was inspired by the Nova Scotia Accessibility Directorate, also with that principle. And so I want to share just a brief, this just introduces three people that we'll hear from a little bit more later in this workshop. So I want to just share, this one's pretty brief, just an introduction to three people with the lived experience with disability.
Hi, folks. My name is Clary Chambers. My pronouns are she and her, and I am a Black queer woman. I live with invisible illness and invisible disability. And in that invisible disability, I am dyslexic, and I also have ADHD. So the way that I interact with the world is a little bit different. But one thing about me, if you are be able to see me that you may not know, is that these things are invisible. So they're different than looking at somebody. I appear to be able-bodied in that I can interact with the world in a way that folks may not assume that there's any disability that I have, but I do have that invisible illness and invisible disability.
My name is Andrew Jansen. I use he and they pronouns. I'm masculine presenting. I have a beard and glasses, and I wear a shoulder brace. And I'm queer. I am disabled. I'm chronically ill. And I also use personal support workers and a power wheelchair in my day-to-day.
Okay, my name is Sheila Johnson. I'm Indigenous. I'm from Millbrook First Nation. And what else about me? I guess that's it. Well, I work in home care. I'm a healthcare provider. Yeah. Okay, well, I am who I am. I've got brown hair and I'm Indigenous.
So that introduces just kind of three people, but three
Hi,
people.
folks. My name is
Three people with very different disabilities. Someone who is deaf, someone who has invisible disabilities in terms of ADHD and dyslexia, and then someone who has mobility and physical disabilities, and all who have intersectional identities. So where their elements of their identities kind of overlap with one another. So this may be stuff that you already know, but I think it's important to really frame accommodations in the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act, because it really prohibits actions that discriminate against people based on the combination of a protected characteristic and a prohibited area. And so that protected characteristic, of course, that we're talking about today is disability. And in combination with employment, it could be housing, it could be services and facilities. So we're really talking about all of these today. So what might accommodations look like in the workplace when you're talking about employment, housing, services, and facilities? And of course, the Nova Scotia Accessibility Act was passed in 2017, and over the next number of years, the Nova Scotia government will be creating 6 accessibility standards, which are currently under development. And so those will really, again, impact this idea of accommodations at work. But all of this kind of rests on what's called the duty to accommodate. And that's about removing discriminatory barriers that are prohibited by the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act. And so, the idea that these barriers hinder an employee's or candidate's full participation in the workplace. And I guess coming out of this, the duty to accommodate is to ensure that managers and employers take a proactive approach to accommodation that supports timely decisions and appropriate support. So that's, again, what we're going to be talking about today. So I want to introduce something called the accessibility continuum, but I don't want to assume that everyone knows kind of, some of the basics around accessibility or accommodation. So I think this, things are accessible when our environments, services, products, and policies are proactively designed and constructed so that people with a disability can fully and equally participate without experiencing barriers. So interesting to really think about this, right? Environments, services, products, and policies, which is really pretty much all of the things we do in, in workplaces are made up of those elements. And so that definition really talked about sort of a proactive approach to accessibility. And I like to frame kind of an accessibility continuum from proactive to reactive. So proactive is like, creating safer, more inclusive workplaces for everyone. That's really proactive when we can do that. Then we're talking about embedding accessibility considerations and representation from the start of a policy, program, service, project. Proactively addressing barriers really comes in the middle there. Addressing barriers as they arise, so more of that responsive approach. And then the last one being, really adjusting environments, services, and products to be able to be used by someone with a disability. So really adjustments that someone has to maybe ask for or disclose their disability around, that comes at more the responsive end. So if we think about this continuum, I'm kind of curious, as we think about, like, what are some examples of that when we think about accommodations? So things like on the proactive end, there are things like, using universal design, psychological safety, and equity and inclusion principles and approaches. That's, very proactive. Creating accessible recruitment and hiring, norms and policies that allow for flexibility. So I think, Rosemary, you brought that up at the very beginning. Flexible hours and work locations, that's a really proactive approach when there's policies that support that. Proactively addressing barriers through things like mentorship, technology, training, physical structures. This is more like, in the middle, but we're still being proactive here. And then changing policies and practices that create barriers. Once you know about those barriers, we're kind of responding to those barriers. And then, this is really responding to kind of individual accommodation requests, whether they be flexibility, software, more time, or more complex, which is sort of like medical or absence management or return to work, for example. So please jump in at any point if you have a question about anything. And but this is really the idea that accommodations aren't just one thing. It's a whole continuum of proactive policies, adjustments, environments, spaces, processes that make the workplace really inclusive and accessible for everyone. So I want us to hear again from Clary, Andrew, and Sheila, just about maybe some of the things that they might need. What are some of the barriers that they face at work and in their lives? And I want you to be thinking about, some of these barriers, because I'll be asking you a little bit about, what kind of accommodations do you think they might need in their workplace?
Sorry,
again,
Corinne, you have
yeah, go ahead.
someone who has a question, Michelle?
Yeah.
Oh, hi, I'm Michelle. So I have an accommodations policy drafted here. We haven't passed it yet.
Yeah.
But would that, like, based on the way you've described the continuum, it would be more responsive than proactive, I think.
Yeah.
Even though it's a policy, because it's like the onus is on the person to disclose, to then get the personal plan put into place.
Yeah.
So would you have any suggestions on how to make that more proactive?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would probably be trying to think about what are the proactive things and sharing even in the policy. What are the proactive things that you already do in your workplace that someone doesn't have to ask about? Do you have a policy around flexible or remote working? Do you have a policy in terms of, that people could wear headphones at work? Or do you have a quiet space? Do you provide ASL or closed captions? Do you, how accessible are your meetings? And so one of the things we like to do is share all of the proactive things we're doing. For example, in my workplace, both with our team, but also when we're providing a service, for example, like a training, we like to ask people, but we also like to say, here's all the things you can expect when we're leading it, different than maybe when AMANS is leading it. And then we ask about their accommodation needs, but that's different than proactively saying, we're going to have, AI generated closed captions. We're going to send you materials in advance. We're going to ensure that, if you've requested ASL or real-time captioning, we're going to make that happen. So I don't know, Michelle, does that answer your question a little bit? Does that
Yes.
give some
Yeah,
sense?
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, just let's hear about some of the barriers that Clary, Andrew, and Sheila face.
Some of the barriers that I face as somebody with an invisible illness and an invisible disability specifically is being able to thrive in a variety of spaces. So for example, going to the movie theaters. When I am at home, when I am working virtually or in person, I'm able to use a variety of accessibility tools. These tools allow me to have closed captions come up so that if I'm on a call or a virtual conversation, I can see closed captions to see exactly what folks are saying. Being dyslexic means that sometimes I miss what people are saying, or I don't understand the word, or maybe I'm not hearing correctly to what is actually being said. Another barrier is intake forms. So when I go to a physio, for example, I have both things that I need to address physically, but I also have this intellectual disability here, learning disability. And when I have to fill out like a paper form and someone says, can you just do that real quick? Like, can you just fill it out real fast? Like, I can't fill it out fast because it takes me a bit longer to read through things, to process things, and it's not accessible. It ends up making me feel uncomfortable. I feel nervous. It causes anxiety. That's going to cause more stress and more issues. So one of those barriers being that when the forms, the intake forms aren't accessible, for me, that's definitely a barrier. Another one, and the last one I'll mention, is that when I'm doing something in the digital space, so that was like a physical example, having an intake form in person. But if somebody has this beautiful PDF and they want me to read through it, if it's not able to be read by a screen reader, for example, it creates a really inaccessible experience. It takes me so much longer to read through something than it does to hear it audibly. And it also creates an environment where I am now at a disadvantage when it comes to, say, applying for a job or a call for speakers or something like that, because I have to now read it instead of using my talk to text tools. And it is something that really delays the process for me.
The barriers that I face in my day-to-day are different depending on the situation and the type of environment that I'm in. But there's a lot of different things that come up. One area that comes up a lot is in the healthcare system. As someone who has chronic illness and different medical conditions, it's something that comes up very frequently with appointments and trying to get places for different healthcare needs. And one of the parts about it is how using a wheelchair and trying to access spaces that are not necessarily built for my mobility aids that I need to get around, but also the challenges that I've experienced with home care workers. And I have my own personal support workers that I hire now through a program, but there's always still those challenges of, are they going to be able to get here in a snowstorm? Am I going to be able to get out of bed? Am I going to be able to eat or take my medication? And I cannot do those things without another person to help me. So they're like really basic tasks and so essential.
Yeah, I do feel very frustrated with the barriers that I encounter. Like at my work, for example, sometimes with the other home care staff, I don't feel connected to them. I don't feel welcome. So sometimes when they have meetings and there's discussions happening and they're sharing with each other about their ideas for the work and what's happening and lots of other things, I'm left out and I feel very frustrated, especially if those things come up last minute, or if there's a meeting maybe the next day and they don't book an interpreter. then I get canceled and I don't go. That's really frustrating. It feels like I'm forgotten about. And I don't know if they think that I can hear them, but I can't. So it causes a lot of misunderstandings, especially with certain words. So I've sat out at times, a few times, because of that. That's a really big frustration of mine.
So I'm curious, what did you hear in those stories about some of the barriers? If you want to pop that in the chat or just come off mute, what did you hear from those stories? It's hard when we're a small group. You're like, no, I don't want to talk today, Corey. So that's totally fine. You know, so thanks, Rosemary. Daily life can be tough, not just work life. That's right. And a lot of what I hear from folks and what I experience myself as being someone who's neurodivergent is just that it takes a lot of energy to have to be thinking about a lot of things like, oh, I know myself when I can work from home versus going to my office, way fewer decisions, way less stress and energy to have to like prepare for that and get there. So, you know, we talked about what accessibility is, and the big thing there is that it's proactive. Accommodation is more of a responsive tool to adjust environments. But again, this is more of that reactive, on the reactive end of the continuum. And, you know, accommodations are solutions that remove or reduce barriers in the environment for one person or a group of people. Yeah, so someone also put in the chat, folks with a disability need to advise others, and that can be hard. Otherwise, some accommodations will not be made available. Yeah, so I've been involved in doing some work around for leaders around how to create a safer space for disclosure of disability. And what I know in that is we still have to do a lot of work around even talking about what disability is, because even when I met with leaders in the public sector, a lot of them were surprised that, you know, invisible disability, like, oh, wow, I didn't realize. So I think it's not always a safe space for people to disclose their disabilities. Absolutely. I think that's why the proactive piece is so important. It doesn't rest on disclosure. It doesn't necessarily rest on, you know, a big plan. And what we know, what I've heard from mostly the public sector, just that most people disclosing, there's a lot of disabilities connected to mental health. And so things like flexibility, things like, you know, being able to flexibility in work hours, locations, you know, being able to, you know, wear headphones, do things like that, not that that's addressing all people with disabilities, absolutely not, but that goes a long way to meeting the needs of a lot of people. So here's some accommodation examples, right? So you've previously put some in the chat, but assistive adaptive technologies such as speech to text, extra time during an interview, flexible working arrangements, as we've talked about, noise canceling headphones, or sensory friendly environments. So this is how the Accessibility Directorate kind of organizes 4 categories of workplace accommodations. So policy and procedure changes, that's around modifying work hours, location of duties, how tasks are expected to be completed. Support, so this is things like employment coaches, you know, guide dog or service animals, personal support workers, interpreters. Equipment, so like assistive technology, alternative work materials, communication aids, ergonomic workstations, and then structural modifications, handrails, ramps, widened doorways. So I think back to the question that you asked about, you know, we have I think it was Michelle, that like that you have more of a responsive or a reactive kind of accommodation policy. So when I look at these four, I'm like, policy and procedure changes, that to me, there's a lot of stuff you can be doing in there that's proactive. There's a lot of stuff in equipment, for example, that could be proactive, letting new hires or existing people know that, hey, if they need something to help them with their work, whether it be, speech to text. For example, I broke my my baby finger, my pinky finger, and I all of a sudden couldn't type. And so I needed to use, obviously that was just a temporary kind of disability, but I couldn't type. And I had to use speech to text tools for, about 4 to 6 weeks. And but those were actually very easy to use, and I'm now using them more, but that would be a very easy thing to just implement all the time. I think the supports and the structural modifications are where you might look at needing to spend more money. And those are maybe a little bit more reactive to those individual situations. So I won't go through we'll just go through these quickly, I guess. Flexible hours, work environments. This is everything from, working from home to part-time to split shifts to scheduling work only in one location. So I heard from someone who has sensitivity, who has low vision, but a lot of sensitivity to lights. And so she had to work in multiple locations, but only 1 or 2 of them really worked for her for the lights, because otherwise she would get migraines. So again, this is like, okay, can we look at her working just in the places that work for her if she can do that work remotely, for example. Written materials in alternative formats. This takes time, but it doesn't really cost money, right? So this is about learning how to make documents accessible, is really what this is about. Accessible PDF formats, making sure that screen readers can read them. And, making sure that whether you're thinking about someone who is using a screen reader or someone who's neurodivergent or who might have low vision, that they can all access the documents that you're creating. Paths of travel, of course, this has to do with built environment, and these are, those structural kind of modifications. So I just want to address kind of one of the biggest accommodation myths out there, is that making accommodations for employees with disabilities is complicated and expensive, when actual research in Canada suggests that between 50 to 80% of suggested accommodations cost the employer less than $500. So again, if you're a company of 500 people and you have to spend $500 per person, that might be a lot of money. But what are the things that can be done without spending a lot of money, but that really make workplaces more inclusive for everyone? And so, how do we accommodate employees? So I want you to again listen to these 3 stories, and this is about kind of the impact of accommodations. What do these 3 people need, and what works for them in terms of accommodation?
It's so good when things actually are accessible. It allows me to not use all of what I call my creative potential, the way in which I navigate a world that is not set up and is not inclusive for folks like me with invisible illnesses and invisible disabilities. And when something is actually accessible, I'm able to thrive because I don't have to use all that extra creativity, all that extra energy in order to access something. So for example, when something is accessible in that there's a PDF or that I can read with my screen reader, or I go into a space and I can tell that they've actually thought about things. One thing that is challenging for me is kind of knowing where to go and trying to, be in that space and not be lost, not be confused. When you don't have to do all those things, I'm not anxious. I'm not feeling, I'm feeling calm. You get to arrive at your space without having to have gone through all of those hoops in order to get there. You arrive in a space where you feel ready to engage in whatever you're doing, unlike feeling like tired, exhausted. So the real benefit is being able to access a space with ease and then use your creative potential, not to just survive in the space, but to thrive and do what you actually came here to do.
And it impacts my work too. I use a program called Dragon Naturally Speaking to type. It's a dictation program that allows me to use my voice to control my computer. And there's been periods this year where it's just stopped working at work, and I haven't been able to do my job. And I know that my people at work understand that, and they know that I need the software, and if it's not working, then I can't do my task. But at the same time, for me to know that there's just this one barrier that is keeping me from doing my job that I want to do, I care about doing, and I care when I'm not able to do it. So it's getting that fixed as quickly as possible so that I can get back to it and do what I'm here to do.
So I would say about half the time it's more of the same, but the other half of the time I am thriving. And that's because I spoke up to my boss. If I needed something, then I asked for it. So I asked for a coworker to come with me some of the time when I'm with clients that I don't always feel safe around. Maybe because I can't hear them. So I've requested to have a coworker with me for safety reasons, for communication reasons. And so some clients have a really soft voice and I can't understand what they're saying, or if they have an appointment or other reasons, or if they need to make a phone call, then my coworker can come with me and make the phone call. And I feel more comfortable when I have that flexibility, for sure.
So those are just, some of the types of accommodations that
It's so
working for these three individuals. So I'm curious, so we're not going to go into breakouts. We don't have time today, but let's just think about some of the scenarios from the videos and what are some possible accommodations. I say from the list, but just that you kind of hear in those videos. What did you hear as some of the accommodations that people were using or given in their workplace? And, come off mute, share in chat. What did you hear from those stories in terms of accommodations? What was maybe, responsive? What was reactive? What was proactive? I'll just give you a minute or so to think about that. Yeah, the reactive, having an extra person go along. Yeah, absolutely. So that person said, hey, I don't feel safe in some of these environments. Can I have someone go along? And that's reactive. And it's also an accommodation that might cost the company or the organization more money, right? If it means that person then can't do their other work. So again, thinking about which ones of these accommodations also cost money. Yeah, and then a proactive is creating PDFs and giving information in advance. So that works for a lot of people and doesn't cost you anything except the time of kind of creating accessible documents. Some of the other, I would say, like, well, I guess it's one thing that I know about Andrew, so I don't think they mentioned it in the video, but just that they work fully remote because of the care needs that they have, and that is a permanent a permanent accommodation. So that would have been reactive, but again, it goes back to maybe that proactive flexibility in the workplace. I heard Clary too, maybe not talking about it so much in this video, but like needing to take more time to complete things if they're not, accessible, for example, or even being dyslexic and with ADHD, maybe needing to take more time. Again, some of those things don't really impact, the budget line, for example. So where I want to move to just for this last section of the workshop is just like what are I like to think about it as, again, I started with the why, right? Why do we accommodate? What's important about that? Then the what are accommodations? And now what I want to move to is just the how, right? How do we ensure that we're following some steps and that we have a process? So again, Michelle, I feel like this goes back a little bit to your like, how do we put a policy in place that recognizes this? So I think about it in sort of these 5 steps. So recognizing the need to remove discriminatory barriers. And again, that's where it's like both proactive and responsive. Gathering relevant information and assessing the needs. So talking about the barriers, gathering information, discussing options, making an informed decision. So if there's a request, more on the responsive end, consulting relevant parties and focusing on solutions, implementing the decision and communicating that, and then keeping records and following up. So documenting the process, follow up, and really making sure you're following kind of privacy and confidentiality. So recognizing the need, right? So generally, again, the onus to request a responsive accommodation is on the person with a disability. And often people may not ask for an accommodation because they don't know that they have a right to ask for it. And a request for accommodation does not have to be in writing. It can look like a conversation with a manager. And just again, we've talked about sort of disclosure. This says during interviews, but this could be at any time. Interviewers or like cannot request a medical diagnosis. They also can't ask questions about an applicant's disability unless a question relates to how they would perform certain job tasks. So, applicants who disclose their disabilities before or during an interview may offer information about a disability, accommodations, or barriers. If they do, the person interviewing, the manager, the leader should really focus on the barriers and how to remove them, not on the diagnosis. So this is really more sort of advice for like, how do you talk to someone about a disclosure? When you're gathering relevant information and assessing needs, really ensuring that employees or candidates understand their responsibilities. Talking with the employee about the barriers that they may face in the workplace and any accommodation that was provided in a previous position. And really the focus should be on finding appropriate and efficient accommodation solutions. And this really includes the person who is to be accommodated involved in the discussions, right? You don't want to have a process where someone else without that lived experience is deciding what the accommodation should be. And then determining with the employee, do they need a formal or a short-term or more informal accommodation, or something that might be temporary, change in hours of work or alternative work location. So all of those things are kind of decisions along the way. Making an informed decision is all about, making sure you're taking the time to review the request, understand the needs, and review any supporting documentation. And that's who needs to be involved in that. Working with all relevant parties, beginning with the employee to determine one or more possible accommodations, and just really trying to find effective, practical, timely, and cost-efficient solutions while really ensuring that the solution reflects the employee's dignity, privacy, confidentiality, comfort, and autonomy. And documenting the process somehow, even if it's just simply a summary email. I think it's important to document that process in writing. When you're implementing the decision, obviously informing the individual, yes. Maybe asking the individual about the best approach to explaining the accommodation to anyone affected, if necessary. So does it impact other coworkers, other team members? What do they need to know about the barriers that the person faces and the kinds of accommodations that might be in place for them? Does anyone else need to know, right? That's a very good question to ask. And ensuring that you and the individual are aware of all the available resources. Or sorry, that should say resources. It says recourses. And also, you know, recourse as well, I guess, if the employee disagrees with the decision, like, what's the process by which they would, you know, talk to someone about that? So documenting and follow-up, you know, just again, this is so important to respect the dignity and privacy of the person being accommodated. And communication with others really should be limited to those who need to know and what they need to know. No one needs to know someone's diagnosis. Really, it's more about, you know, what are the barriers they face, and then what are the accommodations that are being put in place to address those barriers. You know, regular follow-up and modifying the accommodation as needed. And I think, and this one is a key one for the shift from responsive to proactive, integrating accommodation needs into future human resources and business planning. Curious, you know, how many organizations have an accommodations budget line or an accessibility budget line? So that's really, I'd love to, you know, stop the presentation and just see if anyone online has any kind of further questions, as I've talked a little bit more about kind of the process, but also some of the kinds of examples of accommodations. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you, Corey, for this presentation. I had just a comment. I think it's really interesting because before working in this position, I didn't have a lot of knowledge and experience on accessibility. And I think that's something that as individuals working under the equity, anti-racism, as well as accessibility plans, is like we need to have the onus on ourselves to build that education and be a little bit more proactive.
Yeah.
Because like walking into like facilities, like even event spaces or hotels, have more of an accessibility lens where you can notice things that sometimes it cannot be accessible to people. Versus in the past, I would walk in not having that kind of lens and not having that understanding of how like certain things like lighting, for example, can really affect people's vision, and also like having signage on in specific places and locations can really affect a person's way of living. And I think that piece of like really taking it on ourselves to learn about what accessibility is, because there's so many intersects to it. And it is there's so many layers to it as well. And it's not so kind of like black and white in a way.
Yeah. For sure. Michelle, I guess as you're working on your accommodations policy, did anything here kind of jump out at you as like, ooh, oh, haven't thought about this, or, you know, and or what are some of the things that I may have missed in terms of, you know, as we're talking about this?
I think mainly just the responsive and proactive part. Like I've done a lot of research on it. I do have an invisible disability myself, so I kind of have some background in it, but just like knowing what is proactive and responsive, I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, great. And I do just want to share, and just so that, you know, others know, in the chat, I like the idea of letting people know what could be or is offered in a workplace, and that anyone can approach HR or supervisor. So yeah, even if it's not super detailed, that's very proactive. And just finding out how any certain accommodation can or will affect others. So I think about, for example, so someone shared with me, they had a diagnosis of PTSD, and they shared with their manager, they actually created a 2-page kind of like all about PTSD and me. And like, this is what it is. This is how it affects me. This is how it might come up in the workplace. And I thought that was like a really great approach for someone, first of all, to sort of document it, but to bring it to their manager and say, here's some, you know, here's some documentation. Because I think it was impacting the person in their relationships with their team. In particular, if they got really stressed, or if they were like overloaded by too big of a workload, which how many of us are not stressed or overloaded with too much work? So I just found that again. So while again, while that might be a little bit more on the responsive side, I think that person said, yes, they would like that information to be shared with their team because it was quite general about the barriers someone with PTSD might face, for example. And we can't, I don't think in a workplace, like we're not expecting any workplace to be like, okay, here's our policy for PTSD and this one over here is for dyslexia or neurodivergence or someone with a physical, like it just, right? You can't proactively address every type of disability or all the barriers that someone might face. But what are the ones that we can address? And you know, I'm looking at the news, looking in particular at our provincial and federal governments, which are mandating people back to work, especially managers 5 days a week. And I'm just like, how is that creating proactive accessibility and proactive accommodation? I agree, you know, it's great to have people at work, but maybe not just 5 days a week. So I think it's interesting that we've learned so much, especially around the flexibility that we have had during COVID, and that not only are we expecting that now, but people really do people can do really great work. I know, like when I stay at home, I'm like, oh, phew, I'm going to get so much more done today because I'm not then engaging with all my colleagues' side conversations about whatever it might be. So anyway, I just find that really interesting. I just want to share if you're interested in learning more. So through the ACE project, so I'm just going to show you on the Seachange website, we have an ACE program kind of overview. It's a very short page that just, talks about what ACE is. And then we have 2 additional pages. One is the resource hub and one is training. So trainings like these, we offer self-paced skill builders, usually on a monthly basis, on demand at least 2 or 3 times a year, and in person 2 times a year. So here's kind of, you know, here's where you can find out on this page all about what are the upcoming for example, skill builders. We just did one on accessible meetings and events. We have one coming up on recruitment and hiring November 6th, and then plain language part 2. So many, we have our first plain language as an on demand. So this means you can go in and do it at any time. Right here, core skills of plain language. So that's like the one piece around training, but where I want to show you as well is just our searchable resource hub. And so, for example, if you're looking at, I like to look at this one, which is just our tip sheets. And so we have a tip sheet around accommodations at work. And here you can see, yeah, we're talking about what it is. We're talking about the duty to accommodate. We have examples in there. How do we accommodate employees in terms of the process around? So a lot of what was in this training is here in our tip sheet. And then if I go back to the resource page and I say, you know what, I want to search by topic, I'm going to go back up here and I want to search by accommodations. You can see we have actually 24 resources from an accessible recruitment and hiring tip sheet to, you know, videos of people with lived experience, to a case study, to you know, some links like the job accommodation network. And if you're interested in learning more about accommodation and you haven't been to JAN, the Job Accommodation Network, there are so many great resources in this, is specific to job accommodations, you know, an A to Z of disabilities, accommodations, and related topics. So I just wanted to share those resources.
Sorry, I don't know if you're sharing it on the
Oh,
screen.
shoot, I was supposed to be sharing.
I can see it.
Sorry, I had it all set up and then I didn't hit the share button. So this is Jan, but I'll just go back to the resource hub just so you can. So what I did here is I just filtered by topic. Accommodations. We have 24 you know, different resources from videos with lived experience. So again, if you're needing to try to gain some traction in your organization, this really, you know, talks about kind of the why of accommodations. You know, we did a podcast last year and we talked about it. So lots of videos here, but there's also other resources in terms of tip sheets, a 360 perspective on supported employment. And then filtering by type, I went to this just to show we have an accommodations at work tip sheet, as well as an accessible recruitment and hiring tip sheet, which there's a lot around accommodations in there as well. So sorry I wasn't sharing there. But yeah, those are some of the through the ACE project. And then this is just the training that I talked about. So you can go on our website, and at any point you can see what are the upcoming trainings that we have coming up, all for free for employers across Nova Scotia. So thanks everyone. And yeah, great. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and really appreciate you being part of this session.
Thank you, Corey. We really appreciate your lunch and learn and the topic that we discussed over here. Really great feedback and questions. If anybody is looking for advice on policies, specifically in the workplace, I'd highly recommend even going to the equity leads email and like asking that question, because there's always someone who has already created a policy such as that. And so it's something that can be really helpful and beneficial for the organization.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, folks.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.